was this meatpacking revolution that occurred? And it started in Denison, Iowa in 1960 with the founding of IBP. Basically, we had most of the meatpacking operations in metropolitan areas, close to where the stockyards were. Most of you probably don't know what stockyards are. The cattle were shipped to Chicago and South St. Paul and Sioux City and so forth, and then they were slaughtered and processed in the urban areas. So these two young guys had this idea that if you brought the packing plants to the cattle, to where the cattle were being raised, and this was following on to the feedlot growth that began in the 1950s, that you could save a lot of money in transport because you're essentially compacting the product, and you don't have shrinkage of the animal and so forth. But probably more important, but probably less discussed, was the fact that by moving to rural areas, it was possible to find a population that was not as favorable to unions, and essentially that process of moving to rural areas became a union-busting activity. I mentioned, indirectly mentioned the box beef and the de-skilling of butchers. So those people who were working on the packing plant floor were also de-skilled, but also those butchers who were located in your retail grocery stores not only were de-skilled, but eventually completely eliminated. And then because there were no one representing, well, let me put it this way, because there were no strong unions, in some cases there were still unions in the rural areas, but they were not very strong. It was possible to speed up the line, increase the repetitive motion problems and injuries and so forth. And so the jobs, which had been good jobs in the urban areas, turned out to be modest paying jobs and much more dangerous jobs in the rural areas as that shift occurred. And ultimately then, the lower wages and the lousy working conditions meant that they had to recruit people from great distances, including across the border. And this table is the most important thing that I'm going to talk about. And so what we have here is the red line shows controlling for inflation. We have the real value of annual salaries beginning in the 1970s, late 70s, when the salary, according to 1982 wages, were about $27,000. That would be probably about twice that, at least twice that in today's dollars. And if you'll notice, by the time we get over into the past decade, salaries have almost halved. They're no more than 60% of what they were before. And I've just taken one community in Iowa, but I've looked at a number of the packing plant communities in Iowa, and the pattern is generally the same, and that is that we did not get Latinos and immigrants working in the packing plants in large numbers until the 1990s. And so they really started working if somewhere here, probably mid-90s, in most packing plant communities. I don't know, Lexington might have been a little bit earlier than that.
89 and 90.
Yeah.
90.
Lexington, Nebraska. And so it's very clear that already occurred by and large by the time that Latinos started working in large numbers in the packing plants. And that's important because lots of people believe that it was the immigrants who ruined the packing plant jobs. And that's simply not true. The reason that this line is like this and jumps up like that has to do with the estimates that were made year by year on the number of Latinos. And somehow the Census Bureau did not capture the idea that there were significant numbers of Latinos moving in to Iowa and Minnesota and Nebraska and Kansas. And so this line should be smoothed out a little bit more. But the pattern is clear. The wages fell. They couldn't find workers. They went to Mexico and other places to recruit them. Here, this is courtesy of Kathy Fenley at the Humphrey Center, just to get an idea of the size of the minority population, but that's at least in the early part of, or at the turn of the century, that was mostly Latino. And you can see, this is the kindergarten enrollment. And because of the population pyramid structure, that we know that, in a sense, these kindergartners in the early part of the current century are now the beginning, the new workforce in these communities. And what's important is that all of the communities, rural communities in Minnesota that had large numbers of immigrants were communities that also had a meatpacking or related kind of plant or two in town. Okay. Lourdes yesterday talked a little bit about the underestimate of the 2010 census. So somehow, even though they had that problem in the 90s, and they had that problem, they had it again in 2010. I think if they'd looked at school enrollments, given them more weight, they would have had a pretty good idea of how fast the Latino population was growing. So here we have the Hispanic population in the 2010 census compared with the census estimates for 2010. And I just chose Minnesota and Iowa. And you see that for Minnesota, there was about a 7.5% greater number of Latinos, a 7.5% underestimate, basically, of Latinos through the estimates, and an 8.5% difference between the two in Iowa. Okay. Now, here we're looking at unauthorized, or sometimes we call undocumented folks in Iowa, Minnesota. Since we have folks here from Nebraska, I added Nebraska in too. So we have the percent foreign born, which is the blue, and then we have the percent unauthorized. And we see that the ratio between these two, you see in Minnesota, the unauthorized are a fairly small proportion of the foreign born. So that, I think that attests to the fact that you have an awful lot of refugees, perhaps, in Minnesota. And you also have folks that have been here, if they're Latinos, for instance, they've been here longer and so forth. In the U.S., you see that because we have long-term immigration, that ratio is also similar to what it is for Minnesota. But what's really interesting is Iowa, and well over somewhere around half of the foreign-born in Iowa do not have proper papers. And then I just have the Iowa data here. I wasn't able to stay up late enough last night to do Minnesota. This is what has happened between 2000 and 2010 using the census data. And it probably underestimates the numbers of particularly Hispanic and Latinos, because it's harder to count those people who are unauthorized. They don't exactly want to talk to the government. But in the 1990s, we had a 151% increase in Hispanic population. In the first decade of the present century, it's about an 83% increase. Now that's not, we obviously in 1990 started from a very small base, but the Latino population is now about 5% in Iowa. And what's really important here is that the non-Hispanic whites actually declined by 0.3%. In other words, there was no change in that population. So Iowa, I don't know if they would have lost 2 congressional seats if we hadn't had Latinos and other minorities. We lost 1 anyhow. But you can see that much of the dynamism, the economic dynamism in Iowa, derives from the minority population and especially from Latinos. Okay, so I'm taking much longer on the first part, so I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. What are the contributions of new immigrants to Iowa? We had some discussion yesterday about this in general, but let me just give you an example here. From 2000 to 2006, Iowa had a net out-migration of people to other states of about 41,000. And we had a net in-migration of almost that much, 36,000 from other countries. So if we hadn't had that in-migration, we would have clearly have had a net out-migration of people from Iowa during that time period, which was a period of economic growth. The other thing that I wanted to show quickly is, if you look at young people, the differences between races and ethnicities is even greater. So here, this is from 1990 to 2000. I suspect it's going to be very similar to that in the current the decade that just passed. We had a decline of white non-Hispanic under age 18 of about 25%. And if you add together all of the other groups, the Hispanics being the largest, that they tend to balance out so that we had a more or less a constant number of folks under age 18 in Iowa. I won't dwell on this because Linda showed the same thing for Nebraska. But here is the white non-Hispanic population pyramid shaped somewhat like those of us who are in that middle group, and the Hispanic population who really provide the young people that will be the engine of growth for the Iowa economy, the Nebraska economy, and maybe to a somewhat lesser degree in Minnesota, but still true as well. Now, there have been a couple of studies that have been done in Iowa. I don't think they're quite as comprehensive as the ones in